Colin's Last Stand merchandise has finally arrived. I've partnered with Declaration Clothing to bring you high-quality shirts, stickers, and even a poster, all proudly made right here in the United States. If you're interested in checking out my wares and supporting independent, ad-free political and historical content like CLS, please head on over to Declaration Clothing at declarationclothing.com. And yes, I know I look damn good. Now, on with the show. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. As always, I thank you for your time, and I thank you for being here with me today. Today is a bit of a milestone for Colin's Last Stand because this is episode 50, and I knew I had to do something special for it, which is why I look so tired, because I've been working very hard on this video indeed. In fact, I'm recording this pretty late in the game, late at night, and I just wanted to kind of do an intro to what I've been working on and what you guys have helped me work on. So this video of 50 Unsung Heroes is dedicated to you guys out there and to our shared love of history. What I did was I went on Reddit, on Facebook, and on Twitter, and I asked you to just tell me who your favorite unsung hero of history was, and hundreds of you answered me. And I whittled down your list of names to about 100 names, and then I went through and researched all of these names and made a list of 50, with a couple of my own contributions in there, of course, as well. So the following list is dedicated to you. It's dedicated to history. It's dedicated to this environment we've created with Colin's Last Stand. We've created together, you and I. And it's not presented in any order other than alphabetically because I couldn't figure out a fair way to present it otherwise. Obviously, you're going to have heard of some of these people. Others, you will not have heard of any of them. Some are better known in some parts of the world than others. But I wanted to kind of make it an all-encompassing list that will be interesting to many people and hopefully, pique your curiosity so you go and research some of these brave men and women and some of these interesting men and women yourselves. So without further ado, this is Colin's Last Stand, episode 50, the 50 Unsung Heroes of History. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you on the other end for a very short outro. Number 1, Clara Barton. What Clara Barton did during the American Civil War should have alone cemented her place in history. As a nurse, Barton cared for injured Union soldiers from Fredericksburg to Antietam and beyond, as well as Confederate prisoners, making a name for herself enough that she worked for the federal government for a time following the war. However, it was humanitarian work she undertook the following decade in Europe that raised her historical status even more. Inspired by extensive volunteer work being undertaken on the European continent by the International Red Cross, Barton endeavored to found an American branch of the organization, something she successfully did in 1881. Today, the American Red Cross collects some $3 billion a year, of which 91% of that money, after costs, goes directly to thousands of humanitarian causes, helping countless people in need. Number 2. Tim Berners-Lee. There have been a series of essential advancements made since the advent of the computer age that got us from room-sized supercomputers to iPhones in a matter of decades. One such advancement is the World Wide Web, which Tim Berners-Lee invented while toiling away at CERN, Europe's thriving hotbed of scientific and technological advancement. People forget that the internet was more than 20 years old before something called the web page existed. Much like Macintosh and Windows operating systems brought life and utility to complicated and largely inaccessible machines, so too did Berners-Lee bring life and utility to an internet that was previously the domain of governments, militaries, universities, and in-the-know people using arcane bulletin board systems. The web page, as the 90s and 2000s proved all too well, changed the world forever, all thanks to Berners-Lee. Number 3, Norman Borlaug. Agriculture is perhaps the single most underrated component of why humanity has advanced so far in just a few thousand years. If we can't eat, we can't live. And if we can't rely on a steady supply of food, we can't dedicate ourselves to other productive tasks. In modern times, no one contributed more to the advancement of agriculture than Norman Borlaug, who won a Nobel Prize in 1970 for his part in the Green Revolution, the 20th century scientific push to feed an exploding global population. Borlaug's work with wheat in particular was history-changing, creating high-yield, disease-resistant strains of the precious crop that found its way into millions upon millions upon millions of bellies throughout the developing world. Borlaug wasn't particularly worried about rich, advanced countries. He cared about feeding those who were most desperate, making him a heroic, albeit understated, figure of modern science. Number 4, Mary Bowser. At the center of every military conflict is intelligence. The more you know about your enemy, the more likely you are to emerge victorious. Mary Bowser, a black woman born into slavery in the American South, played an underappreciated role in the famous spy ring organized by Unionist Elizabeth Van Lew during the American Civil War. Bowser worked in the belly of the Confederate beast as a servant for CSA President Jefferson Davis, pretending she was illiterate, when she in fact was properly educated after gaining her freedom in earlier years. The Confederate leadership never knew that she was in fact the one leaking a great deal to Van Lew, though what she was specifically responsible for will never be known, due to a lack of record keeping and a fair bit of post-war exaggerating. Number 5. Anne Braden. If the American Civil Rights Movement is a Venn diagram of many circles, one of those circles is certainly the allies African Americans found to fight on their behalf from outside the black community. One of the most prominent of those allies was Anne Braden, who alongside her husband Carl James Braden dedicated everything to racial justice in the United States. Harassed for decades by local law enforcement, state governments, and other defenders of the Jim Crow status quo, Braden's most lasting legacy is found through her Southern Conference Educational Fund, which strived to inform the American population of the plight of Southern black people, especially trying to reach Northern white allies who remained ignorant of or indifferent to this serious racial struggle. While MLK recognized and appreciated her, history has been less kind, likely because of her open support of far-left politics. Number 6. Willy Brandt. With everything going on with the Korean Peninsula these days, we'd be wise to study a parallel situation that occurred in Central Europe, German unification, that was achieved only a few decades ago. At the center of that decades-long push was a man named Willy Brandt, a person so embedded in the struggle for post-war German reunification that he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Germany's reputation was rightfully in ruins after World War II. Brandt's dedication to peace and unity, and his compassionate stance towards East Germany known as Ostpolitik, ensured that the German people could overcome the near past, even if the battle between capitalism and communism found the nation separated in two. Thankfully, Brandt got to witness reunification in his time, but sadly, he only spent 2 years in a unified Germany before his death. Number 7. Isambard Kingdom Brunel. One of the major symbols of the Industrial Revolution is the railway. The further and quicker railways spread around modernizing 19th century countries, the more rapidly a country's economy and connectivity spread thereafter. It was, in short, a race. At the center of a modernizing rail-connected Great Britain was the man with the strangest name on this list, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Brunel was a gifted civil engineer who helped these newfangled rails gain a foothold in his own country, all the while overcoming the enormous complications involved in building the bridges, tunnels, and stations that go along with them. Brunel was also a prolific ship designer. In other words, he was a 19th century British Renaissance man of the post-Renaissance period, who helped shove his nation into the modern era. Number 8. John Churchill. World War II was horrific proof of how far man's ability to make war had come since the era of swords and shields. But one man, Lieutenant Colonel John Churchill, liked those quaint weapons just fine, even when his countrymen and enemies alike were using devastatingly modern firearms and explosives. It's hard to briefly recount all of this man's exploits, but he was bestowed the nickname Mad Jack for a reason. He fought the Nazis with a longbow and a claymore. As a British commando, Mad Jack largely conducted small guerrilla raids on enemy positions, enemies totally untrained to deal with sword and arrow combat. Churchill was captured by the Nazis on multiple occasions, escaping each time, while also surviving gunshot wounds and explosions that should have killed him. Basically, he's the British Andrew Jackson, complete with the assumption by historians that he almost certainly had a screw loose. Number 9. Michael Collins. Everyone remembers what Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin accomplished when Apollo 11 brought those men to the moon, allowing them to partake in the unbelievable, exploring a foreign body in space. But a lot of people forget the man that helped get them there, the third member of Apollo 11, expert aviator and one of America's most skilled pilots ever, Michael Collins. While Armstrong and Aldrin got to walk the surface of the moon, Collins remained in orbit, as the parameters of the mission demanded. His work was essential in getting the trio to the moon and back, and Collins also has the distinction of having been the first person to be completely alone hundreds of thousands of miles away from Earth. Collins remains incredibly humble in regards to his role, yet deserves far more credit for what he did than he normally gets. Number 10. Claudette Colvin. Rosa Parks was an enormously important and influential force in the American Civil Rights Movement. Yet a young 15-year-old black girl named Claudette Colvin did exactly what Parks did, but at a younger age, and 9 months earlier. The situation was identical. A white person asked Colvin to give up her bus seat in Alabama, and Colvin refused. She was arrested for her defiance, later leading to the landmark Supreme Court case, Browder v. Gale. Unfortunately, Colvin was overshadowed by Parks largely due to the pragmatism of the movement. Parks was lighter-skinned and appeared more well-to-do and relatable, which some felt would play well in ally communities the push for civil rights so desperately needed. Colvin's humility and relative silence about what happened in 1955 probably contributed to her not getting the credit she deserves for so bravely standing up to the realities of Jim Crow. Number 11. Clarence Darrow. In an age of celebrity lawyers, Clarence Darrow would fit right in. In fact, he gravitated towards some of the strangest and most sensational cases of his era, turning from corporate lawyer to advocate of the poorer parts of America, particularly within the early labor movement and with an eye towards death row cases, of which he never lost a single one. But Darrow's renown goes far beyond his nearly flawless win-loss record in court on behalf of defendants ranging from anarchists to convicted murderers. He gained his biggest share of fame from defending John Scopes, the Tennessee teacher wrapped up in a lawsuit over teaching evolutionary science to his class in the mid-1920s. The so-called Scopes trial launched into the public consciousness the debate between science and religion that came to dominate both fields for decades to come, and Darrow's spirited defense was one of the case's greatest draws, even if he technically lost. Number 12. Bob Feller. Sometimes drastic times call for drastic measures. More than that, though, drastic times call for selfless heroes, and that's exactly who Bob Feller was. Bob Feller is best known for his exploits on the baseball field. He was a gifted pitcher, a Hall of Famer who won 266 games in his MLB career. That might not seem like an astronomical amount of wins until you realize that Feller, at the peak of his career as a 23-year-old, took a 4-season hiatus from the league to volunteer for the U.S. Navy, even though he was draft exempt and even though he was famous and rich. He wasn't remotely the only athlete to do what he did, but he was easily among the first, enlisting directly after Pearl Harbor and foregoing his lucrative contract extension with the Cleveland Indians. Feller probably wouldn't even know what to do with himself in today's era of high-paid, me-first prima donna athletes. Number 13. John R. Fox. Some of warfare's greatest heroes are those that don't see the end of the conflict. Such is the case of John Robert Fox, an American soldier so dedicated to his country's cause during World War II that he requested friendly artillery fire rain down on his position just to kill an aggressive Nazi contingent. Originally positioned in a small Italian town so that he and a small group of American soldiers could coordinate artillery fire on the enemy, Fox insisted that the far-off gunners he was radioing with destroy his position before it was overrun by the enemy in what can only be described as an unmatched act of valor. It wasn't until well after the war that Fox received any sort of distinction, primarily because Fox was a black man in a segregated military serving a segregated nation, a terrible misjustice of history that has, thankfully, been repaired with time. Number 14. Gunner the dog. On this list of 50 unsung heroes are 49 humans and 1 dog. And no, it's not Lola. The usefulness of various animals, from pigeons to horses, isn't at all unheard of in the history of combat, but there's one special story out of World War II era Australia that resonates above many others. A dog, a Kelpie to be exact, named Gunner would alert Australian military personnel as to when an enemy aircraft was approaching, as opposed to a friendly Allied aircraft. Gunner's ability to differentiate between noises that sounded identical to his human friends likely came from a harrowing experience the dog had with Japanese bombers that nearly killed him during an earlier raid. Gunner ended up alerting his walking, talking buddies no fewer than 60 times during the war, allowing Allied soldiers to get out of harm's way before the bombers took aim, making him a hero who didn't even know what he did. Number 15. Maurice Hilleman. There's a constant in history stretching back thousands of years. Diseases and viruses wreak havoc on societies the world over. The Black Death ravaged Europe. European germs in turn obliterated Paleo-American civilizations, and so on and so forth. The era of vaccination attempted to put all of that to an end, though, and no one is responsible for more in the field of vaccination than Maurice Hilleman. Indeed, there are 14 vaccines regularly given today, and 8 of them come from Hilleman, which is nothing compared to the more than 40 he invented in total. Measles, hepatitis A and B, meningitis, influenza, mumps, pneumonia, rubella. These are just some of the ailments Hilleman's vaccines tackled. He's responsible for saving the lives of millions upon millions of people and their descendants, not to mention saving millions and millions more from debilitating illnesses that could take a person's sight, hearing, and mind. Number 16. Grace Hopper. Without something to do, an operation to run, a calculation to solve, a program to execute, a computer is just a pointless hunk of metal. Computers need programmers, and one of the earliest and most prolific of these essential mathematical minds was Grace Hopper, a woman who would rise to the rank of admiral in the U.S. Navy. Hopper worked on the Mark I computer during World War II and remained intimately involved in U.S. naval computer advancements until the mid-1980s. She also found incredible success in the private sector, when most companies still had no idea how to harness the power of a computer. Interestingly, Hopper is probably best known for a term we still use every day when talking about computers: bug. The term may have been invented by her and was certainly popularized by her because of a moth that interrupted a computer she was programming. Number 17. Herbert Hoover. Out of all the names on the list, Herbert Hoover's might be the most well-known. I mean, Herbert Hoover was President of the United States, not exactly a minor man in a minor job. But there's something unfortunate about Hoover's legacy that needs to be repaired, something overlooked about him that's more important than his disastrous presidency. He's one of the great philanthropic souls not only in American history, but in the history of humankind, certainly up through his heyday in the first half of the 20th century. Both independently and with friends, both through private and public organizations, Hoover marshaled money, material, and manpower to help in a great number of charitable cases, especially those revolving around destitution and destruction left in the Great War's wake. Today, Hoover is largely remembered as the man who was president during the start of the Great Depression, but in reality, there's a whole lot more to the man than that. Number 18, Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr is a bit of a contradiction, as she's well known for two completely different things. On one hand, she was a famous actress. On the other hand, she was a renowned inventor. Indeed, it's the latter skill set that she's best known for today because it's a piece of technology she helped pioneer that revolutionized communication and connectivity. As an Austrian emigre to the United States, Lamarr wanted to help take down the Nazis, and she did. With a co-inventor, Lamarr created what was called spread spectrum communications, a piece of technology that jumbled radio frequencies so that the enemy couldn't get a lock. Interestingly, this technology became even more important later, and is still essential in everything from cell phones to Wi-Fi. In fact, many say that her invention wasn't truly appreciated until the 1980s, since it's at the center of a couple of pieces of enormously important tech from that era. Number 19, Amy Johnson. When it comes to early female aviators, Amelia Earhart takes up much of the oxygen, and for good reason. She was a brave and heroic pilot in her own right. But she wasn't the only one of her gender to make hay. So too did British pilot Amy Johnson. In the 1930s, in the shadow of World War II, Johnson was a bit of a tour de force. She flew to Australia from Great Britain all on her own. She soloed missions to Moscow and to Japan too. And when the war finally came, she served her country as a capable pilot in the Royal Air Force. Unfortunately, it was during that service that she perished in a plane crash, as so many promising pilots from her era did. But it didn't stop her from making a name for herself. A capable pilot and a person who could fix her own plane, Amy Johnson's name rings through aviation history. Number 20, Aldo Leopold. Conservation is an essential field that allows Earth's greatest treasures to be handed down, as it were, from one generation to the next. And the USA, in particular, has been blessed with an extraordinary amount of beautiful, untamed, and diverse land populated by flora and fauna largely unique to the continent. A pioneer of American conservation is a man named Aldo Leopold, who was an early, loud, and prominent voice in the battle between the spread of industry and the sanctity of nature, and how both can exist in unison with one another, so long as protecting land and the wildlife that inhabited it was held paramount. Land conservation during the early 20th century was a relatively new phenomenon, and Leopold wanted to inject it with a dose of responsibility, encouraging everyone to take ownership of the country's rapidly deteriorating landscape, a lesson we could still easily learn from today. Number 21, Sybil Ludington. Paul Revere is a Revolutionary War hero because of his famous ride. Sybil Ludington, though? You've probably never heard of her. Ludington, who was the daughter of an officer in the Continental Army, did in 1977 pretty much exactly what Paul Revere did just a couple of years earlier. She rode dozens of miles by horseback in the middle of the New England night in order to alert people in the Connecticut countryside that redcoats were advancing on a rebel store of equipment at Danbury. The roads weren't well maintained, it was raining, and loyalists and highwaymen alike were on the prowl. But Ludington delivered the message successfully, so successfully in fact, that George Washington himself thanked her for what she did. But history has largely forgotten her very own midnight ride and the 16-year-old heroine that, in her own way, changed the course of the American Revolution. Number 22, Francis Marion. No, I'm not including Francis Marion on this list because he took part in the battle at Fort Sullivan, which is where this YouTube channel got both its name and logo. He's included here because he's a bona fide badass. The very historical figure Mel Gibson's character in The Patriot is loosely modeled after. By the time the revolution came about, Marion was an experienced soldier. He used that experience to deadly effect in the war, earning the nickname Swamp Fox for his unorthodox and largely unheard of nighttime guerrilla tactics that targeted supply lines, officers, and anything else that could undo British gains. Marion and his crew of irregulars were often outnumbered, but rarely took losses, and he, for good reason, joined the rung of war heroes just below that of the founders themselves. Number 23, Lise Meitner. Brilliant females have often been given short shrift by history, and scientist Lise Meitner, whose discoveries forever changed the world, is one of those women. Meitner's career in physics and chemistry began at the turn of the 20th century, but her most major contributions revolve around nuclear fission, which, when discovered, alerted bright minds the world over that nuclear energy could be harnessed, perhaps in the form of a terrifying new weapon. Her longtime academic partner, Otto Hahn, won a Nobel Prize during World War II for research both he and Meitner conducted together, while Meitner only got the credit she deserved a couple of decades later. Still, in everything written about the chase for the bomb, Meitner is a largely forgotten about component to the larger science being conducted. Yet another brilliant mind chased out of Hitler's Europe only to come back and bite him and the Axis later on down the line. Number 24, Audie Murphy. As a Texan who made his name in Europe, Audie Murphy is incredibly deserving of more accolades for what he managed to accomplish in World War II. Since the war ended in 1945, Murphy's story has been more and more obscured, which is a shame since what he managed to accomplish is the very definition of valor. Winning 28 medals in 3 years of combat with fascist forces throughout Europe, Murphy was no stranger to heroics, but his conduct early in 1945 in occupied France, in which he single-handedly held off an advancing group of Nazi infantry, killing or wounding 50 of them on his own, is the stuff of legend. Badly injured from the ordeal, full of bullets, shrapnel, and with burns, Murphy then led his men on a counterattack, making permanent his hard-fought gains. War is hell, and it renders the unbelievable, and as Murphy's men noted, what they witnessed out of him was nothing short of staggering. Number 25, Nancy Hart. The American Revolution gave us tons of memorable names, but it's lesser-known individuals like Nancy Hart that truly get the brain churning. Hart, a Georgian, was by all accounts an imposing and mighty figure, illiterate but incredibly intelligent. During the American Revolution, Hart used her brutish figure to her advantage, dressing up as a man and pretending to be mentally challenged in order to gain access to British encampments, where she would eavesdrop on conversations and then relay that information back to the Continentals. And when the Tories finally figured out where her sympathies lie, they came to regret it. Hart shot and hanged multiple redcoats herself, all the while her husband was serving the Patriot effort in a more official fashion, leaving her to her own devious devices. Number 26, Alexander Parks. Modern life without plastic is inconceivable, and we have one man to thank for early pioneering work that led to the discovery of one of mankind's most useful inventions. Alexander Parks, a British chemist and metallurgist, stumbled upon what he called Parkesine, which was in essence the first plastic in the mid-19th century. This was after he already helped pioneer the strengthening of metal alloys and the separation of metals, which would have alone cemented him a place in history. But his work on plastics was something else entirely, and not even he really knew what he had, as his business venture to take advantage of his discovery failed dramatically. Still, his work paved the way for other scientists to create better, more durable, and more commercially successful plastics in the decades after, and the world simply wouldn't be the same without his unassuming synthetic compound. Number 27, Sam Patch. Daredevils, the people willing to do crazy and unthinkable things for the delight of an audience, seem almost quaint today, in a day where everyone and anyone can film themselves on an iPhone and upload it to Facebook or Twitter. But back in the 19th century, a person's heroics would be spread by word of mouth, and Sam Patch of New Jersey was one such man who did crazy things that the crowd loved. He'd jump off of bridges and waterfalls, off of tall ship masts and dizzying high cliffs. He even jumped into Niagara Falls not once, but twice, surviving both encounters. Unfortunately, a jump into the Genesee River cost him his life, but not before he made a name for himself with all of those who saw with their own two eyes what he managed to do. In a 21st century partially molded by self-made, obsessively promotive celebrities, Sam Patch would be right at home. Number 28, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. During World War II, death was commonplace, and it wasn't unusual for a soldier who saw plenty of action to walk away with a dozen kills or more before all was said and done. But no one comes close to what Soviet female sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko managed to achieve when she killed 309 Nazis, all the while living to tell the tale, although she was wounded on 4 separate occasions fighting for her country. Amazingly, 36 of those kills were enemy snipers, meaning she had a perfect record in identifying and killing her mark before they could turn the tables on her. What's even more remarkable is that she attained those kills in well under 2 years of combat, at which point the Soviet army wisely made her a trainer for other snipers. Pavlichenko is your classic overlooked figure of history, one who haunted the nightmares of the Nazis until they finally surrendered 3 years after her final kill. Number 29, Frances Perkins. It's amazing and sad to think that it's not even been fully a century since women were officially given the right to vote in the United States. Indeed, the presidential election of 1920 was the very first time women across the land could cast their ballot. Soon thereafter, women took another quantum leap when FDR made Frances Perkins the very first female cabinet secretary in a presidential administration. As Secretary of Labor, Perkins played a key role in the shaping of America's response to the Great Depression, and her hands can be seen all over the New Deal and its many policies. She held a position through all 4 of FDR's terms, and fought a very liberal series of fights for the minimum wage, against child labor, and in support of unemployment payments for the down on their luck. We talk about breaking glass ceilings today. Perkins broke an important glass ceiling of her own nearly a century ago. Number 30, Stanislav Petrov. It can be easily argued that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction kept everyone safe during the height of the Cold War. But the actions of a few brave individuals in the movement of peace should also be highlighted, among them Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. In 1983, a decision Petrov made was the literal difference between nuclear war and the status quo. Soviet computers were being alerted that no fewer than 5 US-fired nuclear-armed ICBMs were en route to Russia. His job was to escalate word of the firing to the Soviet High Command, but Petrov distrusted his new computers and instead trusted his gut. And he was right. It was a false alarm. Instead of reporting the attack, he mentioned to the leadership that there was a malfunction, one that could have caused all-out nuclear war between the Cold War's two starring adversaries. Thankfully, it never happened. All thanks to Petrov. Number 31. Otto Frederick Rohwedder. Otto Frederick Rohwedder may be the most random entrant on this list of 50 historical figures, although his contribution to humanity directly touches many of our lives, perhaps even every day. That's because Rohwedder invented sliced bread. Literally, he invented the entire notion of buying bread that was pre-sliced and ready for sandwiches, as opposed to buying loaves you'd have to hack apart yourself. In the decade before World War II, Rohwedder patented his design for a bread slicing machine, which was then picked up by commercial bakeries before reaching the mainstream mere years later. He even invented the act of wrapping the sliced bread to keep it fresh. Sadly, the Depression brought about hard times for many, including Rohwedder, and he had to sell his patent, so he never reaped the financial benefits he would have if he held on for a while. Thank you, Otto, for the best thing that's called sliced bread. Number 32. Bayard Rustin. The post-World War II civil rights movement that engulfed the United States has a handful of godlike figures and a whole slew of activists who haven't received the credit they rightfully deserve. Bayard Rustin was a hero of the movement, but two major things got in the way of him and sustained historical fame. He ascribed the tenets of communist and socialist thought, and he was gay. In 1950s and 1960s America, it's hard to imagine a more unfortunate social combination than gay, black, and communist. Still, Rustin's influence loomed large. He helped to introduce Martin Luther King Jr. to the doctrine of nonviolence, while also acting as key organizer for 1963's famous March on Washington. Still, his openly gay lifestyle proved to be a barrier to him and lasting fame, and Rustin took an undeserved back seat in the movement, beginning in the early 60s, though he fought for black and gay civil rights well into the 1980s. Number 33. Deborah Sampson. Until the modern era, warfare was pretty much entirely a man's game. Women were tangentially involved in all sorts of ways, from nursing to supplying to strategizing, but they almost never took the field, especially in the 18th century, when the American Revolution raged. Deborah Sampson is the exception to the rule. Late in the war, Sampson disguised herself as a man, renamed herself Robert Shirtleff, and joined a regiment native to her home state of Massachusetts. She did all she could to hide her gender, even removing a ball from a gunshot wound herself. But after some notable successes in 1782 and 1783, she was found out. But no one was mad. Instead, she was honorably discharged and given a military pension, something completely unheard of for women at the time. Not bad for a young lady compelled into military service in part through the advice of a fortune teller. Number 34. Laura Secord. Laura Secord, or Secord, far better known within Canada than she is outside of it, is kind of like the Canadian Paul Revere. During the War of 1812 that pitted the United States against British Canada, the US invaded the territory of its northern neighbor. As the American military moved further into Canada in 1813, Secord and her family were coerced into housing and feeding American soldiers, just as British troops did to Americans during the Revolution. Proximity made Secord privy to information about enemy troop movements, the seriousness of which convinced her to walk 20 miles to warn her country's military of an impending sneak attack. The Canadians managed to flip the script on the Americans, ambushing them and forcing them to surrender, all thanks to Laura Secord's bravery and willingness to act. Number 35. Irina Sendler. When the Nazis took over much of Europe, there was plenty of good people willing to risk their lives to do the right thing. One such person was Irina Sendler, a Polish Catholic woman who, with some help, saved somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Jewish children from almost certain death at the hands of the German occupiers. How did she do it? Often one kid at a time and with the assistance of some friends and church officials. The Polish Jewish ghettos were terrible places, and most occupants understood they'd soon be killed if nothing changed. Sendler helped save their newest generation, feverishly working until she was captured and nearly executed for her so-called crimes, saved only at the last minute, and thereafter being forced into hiding. Sendler stood up when she didn't have to. She should be applauded for doing so. Number 36. Robert Gould Shaw. Robert Gould Shaw was raised in a wealthy family in the pre-American Civil War North, where his parents' stark anti-slavery views were instilled in him. When the Civil War rolled around, Shaw enlisted and rapidly rose up the ranks. By 1863, Shaw found himself in charge of the Massachusetts 54th, an all-black unit, which he led reluctantly. But both Shaw and his men were able to show their mettle that summer, when he and 272 of his men were mowed down by Confederate troops assaulting their strategic post called Fort Wagner, which helped protect the southern stronghold of Charleston, South Carolina. Shaw died, bravely leading his men as opposed to standing behind them, perishing alongside them, and even being buried in a mass grave with them, a sign of open disrespect from the Confederacy that ended up having the exact opposite effect for Shaw's family and his memory in the North. Number 37, Yi Sun Shin. Korean Naval Commander Yi Sun Shin deserves a tip of the cap. With a long, storied, complicated, and sordid military career spanning many decades of the 16th century, his exploits during Japanese invasion attempts during the end of that century are the stuff of Korean legend. At a disadvantage to the Japanese in every way, Shin partook in a series of naval battles that kept the enemy unable to take Korea. That is until Shin was demoted, at which point the Japanese performed much better, and Shin was brought back in once more to lay the hurt down on the Japanese. Shin is best known, however, for his so-called turtle boats, outrageously fortified ships outfitted with dozens of cannons each, armor plating with knives and spears sticking out to stop enemy sailors from boarding it, and unmatched speed and maneuverability, technology that gave Korea the upper hand. Number 38, Samantha Smith. Sometimes a child's ignorance to a situation leads to revelations for the adults that thought they knew better. Samantha Smith was an American girl who, at age 10, wrote a letter to Soviet Premier Yuri Andropov to let him know that she and her classmates were becoming increasingly worried about all-out nuclear war between the United States and the USSR. Remarkably, not only did Andropov's inner circle receive the letter, they published it in the Soviet newspaper Pravda and later invited Smith to the Soviet Union to meet with them. The experience catapulted Smith into the spotlight, a curious and engaging little girl with a passion for politics and world peace. Unfortunately, at age 13, Smith died in a plane crash, leaving an undoubtedly powerful life unlived. All the more reason we should remember her today. Number 39, Violet Szabo. There are few things in history more riveting than British intelligence, what with their James Bond-esque reputation and their penchant for all things cool. One such intriguing agent of British intelligence was Violet Szabo, who literally parachuted into Nazi-occupied France during World War II in order to conduct some clandestine operations. Szabo got her start earlier in the war, working with the Special Operations Executive, compelled into service after her husband was killed by Nazi Germany. She was well-trained, highly skilled, and had some experience in the field before her fateful trip into France right after D-Day. She was spotted and pursued along with French agent Jacques Dufour soon after arriving, and sacrificed being captured to save him. She refused to give him up even after being tortured and raped by the Gestapo. Sadly, she perished at a Nazi concentration camp right before the war ended. Number 40, Hugh Thompson. War isn't only dangerous for the body and mind, it can also be dangerous for the soul. Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, while flying a recon mission in Vietnam in 1968, happened upon a Vietnamese village named My Lai, which they viewed in ruins, with bodies strewn everywhere, as American soldiers continued to commit atrocities right before his very eyes. Thompson landed his chopper and immediately came to the aid of the defenseless Vietnamese, potentially putting him in conflict with friendly forces, which he held his own firearm towards as the Vietnamese escaped. The slaughter ostensibly occurred to avenge fallen American soldiers, but Thompson had none of it, later testifying before Congress about the so-called My Lai massacre, while putting his own life in danger back at home. It was only in the 1990s that he was officially recognized for his bold act of bravery and humanitarianism. Number 41, Pat Tillman. What can you say about a man who had it all, yet voluntarily gave it up to bravely serve his country? Pat Tillman began playing in the NFL in 1998. By 2002, Tillman was in a far different world, enlisting in the Army and becoming a Ranger who would do 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan in the years right after 9/11. Any person who serves and commits to a life of sacrifice is inherently brave, but Tillman's sacrifice was more tangible than most. Tillman turned down an offer of $1.2 million a year from his Arizona Cardinals when he enlisted. Sadly, Tillman never returned from his second tour. He was killed in 2004, almost certainly by friendly fire. While renowned in the NFL, the memory of Tillman, and what he and his sacrifice represent, has dimmed mightily elsewhere. A shame, since Tillman has a whole new generation to teach. Number 42, Mikhail Tukhachevsky. It's not terribly uncommon for a person to work hard toward change, yet not be around to witness that change have a positive effect. When it comes to Soviet history, Mikhail Tukhachevsky is one such person, a Russian military mind responsible for making the Red Army into a fit fighting force, setting it on a course for victory over the Nazis. Tukhachevsky was executed in 1937, accused by Joseph Stalin of treason, but not before he streamlined, modernized, and organized the entire Soviet war machine. Tukhachevsky's past makes him a more questionable entrant than most, since he was also responsible for some terrible stuff. But there's no doubt that the Soviet Union wouldn't have been prepared for the Nazis without him, and if the Soviets fell to Nazi Germany instead of holding out, the world would likely be a far, far different place today. Number 43, Alan Turing. Out of all the names on this list, Alan Turing is certainly the one that's currently getting the most well-deserved fanfare many decades after his major contributions to the world played out. Turing was a British mathematician who was at the very center of the Allied victory over the Axis, and in particular, over Nazi Germany. His work cracking the German Enigma cipher broke the intelligence war wide open for the UK and its friends, and that really only scratches the surface of his accomplishments. Many outright credit Turing with creating computer science, one of the most important fields of study in the entire world, and more recent investigations into artificial intelligence also have their origins in Alan Turing's work. Sadly, Turing was expelled from the inner circle he worked with over his homosexual lifestyle, robbing him of his rightful place in history. His early death in the 1950s was a major loss for scientific inquiry. Number 44, Gebhard von Blücher. If you're a man who stands in the way of another man many deemed completely unstoppable, you more likely than not deserve your fair share of credit. Few people were ever able to stand in the way of Napoleon Bonaparte, and one of those men is Gebhard von Blücher, a Prussian field marshal who, in 1815, played a major role in defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, thus sending Bonaparte fleeing. Von Blücher wasn't a particularly gifted tactician, nor was he anywhere on the level of Napoleon when it came to military minds. He simply executed on a plan and got things done in the heat of battle, placing him in an important role in history, albeit one that doesn't approach household name status. The fact that von Blücher was likely insane, particularly towards the end of his life, probably doesn't help matters much. Number 45, Alfred Russel Wallace. Charles Darwin is perhaps one of the most important, most celebrated, most well-known, and most culturally ubiquitous scientists that has ever lived. And it makes sense why. His theory of evolution, today colloquially known as Darwinism, is at the very foundation of our understanding concerning major portions of biology, anthropology, archaeology, and history. It's just that Alfred Russel Wallace came up with the evolution-natural selection combo at the same time and has never received credit for the role he played. Charles Darwin independently conceived of these notions, but it was Wallace's attempt to publish his findings that caused Darwin to publish first. Darwin's fame is deserved, Wallace's obscurity isn't. In fact, it's one of scientific history's greatest crimes that's only recently been rectified in some respect, but we still have a long way to go. Number 46, Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker was born just a couple of years after the American Civil War ended. By the time she died following World War I's conclusion, Walker was worth a fortune, money made off of hair products made specifically for black customers. Walker's acumen as a businesswoman allowed her to become a multimillionaire in the United States at a time when it was virtually unheard of either for an African American or an independent woman to become gratuitously wealthy, serving as a potent symbol of what could be in a nation that long kept, and continued to keep, black people down. Better yet, Walker didn't just hoard her wealth or live a life of opulence like many rich people of her time did. Instead, she gave much of her money away to philanthropic causes and worked to better the lives of the African American community she owed so much of her success to. Number 47, Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton's story is the story of a good man who did good things, a story of a man who did what an extraordinary situation demanded. When Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in the summer of 1939, Winton sprung into action, saving nearly 700 Jewish children in the invaded territory from almost certain death. He did so by organizing transport for these children back to the safety of Great Britain, securing funding for their care, and doing all of it in his spare time. In fact, not even his wife knew what he did until the late 1980s, at which point Winton's story was finally told publicly for the first time. His extraordinary bravery was matched only by his compassion and humility, a trio of character traits we could all strive to emulate, even if we may not be responsible for hundreds of lives that would have otherwise been prematurely snuffed out of existence for no reason at all. Number 48. Abraham Woodhull. Benedict Arnold and John Andre are well-known British spies from the American Revolution, with the former living to tell the tale, while the latter wasn't so lucky. Far lesser known is the man who helped expose their treachery to the world, Abraham Woodhull. The Culper spy ring, the Continental Army's spy initiative used to great effect during the American Revolution, has always been a point of fascination for historians, and Woodhull is finally starting to rise to the prominence he deserves, thanks to the television show Turn, which celebrates his actions and the actions of his Culper Ring co-conspirators. Woodhull's work proved essential to American success in the mid-Atlantic, as he and his friends worked primarily out of the Tory strongholds of Long Island and New York City. In an era soaked in memorable names, Abraham Woodhull's is bound to rise even further up the ranks in the years to come. Number 49, Victoria Woodhull. In 2016, America fell just shy of having the first female president of the United States. But Hillary Clinton was hardly the first woman to go for the prize. In fact, you have to go back so far in American history to find the first woman who ran that the woman in question, Victoria Woodhull, wouldn't have even been legally allowed to vote for herself. Way back in 1872, Woodhull ran on the Equal Rights Party platform and remained outspoken about women's advocacy long after her run. In fact, running came at a cost. Before running, Woodhull was a successful businesswoman and entrepreneur, but afterwards she had a much harder time because of public criticism and derision. Still, she remained dedicated to women's rights and philanthropy, and lived a long life, although she only really started to become a true historical curiosity around the time Hillary Clinton first ran for president in 2008. Number 50, Steve Wozniak. When you live your entire adult life in the shadow of the formidable Steve Jobs, it makes sense that you might be an afterthought. Steve Wozniak, often referred to only as Woz, was the brains behind the original Apple I computer. While Steve Jobs had the vision of what all of it meant and how computers could change the world, Wozniak was busy making those world-changing computers reality. Because Wozniak insisted on remaining out of the public eye, and since he stuck steadfastly to humility, the far more egotistical Jobs got most of the credit for what Apple managed to do at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. But make no mistake about it, Apple would not exist if not for the brilliance of Steve Wozniak, whose creations were launched to the world on the back of one of humanity's greatest visionaries. Well, that's it for episode 50 of Colin's Last Stand. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, thank you so much for what you've allowed me to do with this show. I really do hope that you're enjoying it, that you're seeing its evolution before your very eyes, and that you feel like it's getting better, because I feel like it's getting better each and every week. Please thumb up the video if you liked it, thumb it down if you don't, share it with friends and family, leave comments below. I'll be down there chatting with you. And of course, keep coming back to Colin's Last Stand for more history, more politics, and more fun. Remember, you can also find the Fireside Chats podcast. You can find Made in the USA CLS merch at declarationclothing.com. And you can find me over at Patreon if you want to throw me a few bucks for this ad-free and independent show. I'll see you for episode 51 as we march towards episode 100. Until then, keep on learning.